Okay, good morning, everyone. It is great to be here digitally with everyone who's been able to attend. Uh, I want to make a really quick introduction and get started with this lecture. My name is Bowen. I am the chair for the Multi-Disciplinary Design Program, which is also the division of Multidisciplinary Design, which is a recent thing for our small program at the University of Utah here within the College of Architecture and Planning. And I'm just really excited to be here, and I want to welcome everyone. I'm going to bring up my first slide, and then we will get started. For all the for students who have attended and anything like that, just thought it was kind of funny right before we started as time ticked down. I'm a little bit nervous right now, even though this is digital and I'm sitting in a room staring at a screen. So that's kind of cool. Go here. And here. Okay, so I'm going to assume that Anna you'll tell me if anything is not right, but you should be looking at one screen now. Yeah, for an introduction, what we're here to talk about today, and again, I've kind of made my introduction here, so I'm going to go to the next slide, is that we're talking about designing the future. And I was asked to give a talk. This is kind of shaped towards alumni, but I understand the audience is a little more broad. And back to the audience, I just kind of want to acknowledge that, yes, we do have alumni here, which is very exciting. And the alumni, I want to welcome you both from our program. I know you're coming from other programs on campus. You've graduated with other degrees. I also want to welcome people from the profession that have joined us, and then and especially people who are joining us from other parts of the U.S., people who come from other parts of my life. Back when I was teaching at the University of Houston, at the College of Architecture and Design there. And so it's just really great to be able to talk today. And then I know we also have some students from our program visiting. So framing today's talk about designing the future, and as you can read on the screen, we're talking about education. If you've known me for more than a year, you know that I'm profoundly interested in not just design as a profession, but design as something that changes our lives. So one of the things I'll start with here is that, I am here speaking to you today. I mean, from 18, what are we at now? We're at almost 29 years later, almost 30 years later from when I began my journey in design. And I began through architecture in Houston at the University of Houston. And I can tell you that first day of school, that first day of understanding what design was, profoundly changed my life. It changed the way that I saw myself and that I saw the world around me. It gave me hope. It gave me connection to other people. And I just began expanding from that moment at this wild rate of learning about the world and learning about all the differences that we exist with, and how wonderful that is when you actually become a designer and what it gives you. And so I stand kind of on that platform. And I also want to say that today's lecture is really a reflection of my views of design. And while I believe a lot of these blend into our program, and in framing this, and what I want to do today is just talk about me as a faculty and what I see in this. So what I really love about our program is that we share many different views and we come from different places. And so the idea of multidisciplinary design as a program, as a division in the college, it sits on more legs than just what I'm presenting today. But I think this will give everybody a kind of a good understanding. So to the fun part, I want to, since the audience is varied, I'm going to give a brief overview of the program and then kind of move in to some concepts on design education that I feel are really important. And then I'm going to finish up with 3 student projects that have come out of the last year, especially during COVID in our program, but just kind of show the breadth of what can happen when students are given what I consider a pretty credible opportunity to see themselves clearly as designers, and then to practice on that and to actually move on that. So the Multidisciplinary Design Program, ultimately we're a product and experience design program. That's usually how we put out to the world, so that our students can go out and kind of absorb themselves and to society and get jobs. But it's a lot more than that. I think academically we focus on digital product, physical, and platform product. Platform is probably the more interesting one to describe, which is, when we interact with larger systems, the platform, like the government or Pinterest is a platform, and we've kind of become the product for that. So currently, when I came here, we were about 30 or 40 students in the program. We're almost 100 students in major now. We usually have about 140 students outside of the major, kind of circling ready for application. And we've grown significantly. Our students receive a Bachelor of Science in Design, which is a very important designation in academics, meaning that they experience their academic careers, experience everything from the sciences, humanities to the arts, but lean a little bit more into the sciences, which I think provides a unique perspective as they push through. The quick diagram of evolution about kind of what we've been talking about in our program and how we've come about and thinking about what our program has become, especially recently, is that if we go back, probably more than 100 years ago, and even beyond that into thousands of years back, that this idea about design was about we could make these physical things, and then the first thing that kind of enveloped the physical invention of objects and things that would serve us is, once we got to do that, so let's say we could make the bowl, we could make the columns that would hold the lintel that would become a building. Eventually, we would repeat those things over and over again, and within the consistency of repetition, we developed craft, and the craft of objects, this consistency. That often leads to things like the textures we see in weaving and masonry work and all kinds of things, to the perfection we see in plastics and other things and digital technology. Craft has become very important, but as we moved on, this idea of digital began to surround the physical, and it's really important to watch it in this mode here, because if we look at digital technology and how it first served us, it was to aid this idea of manufacturing, which is now the outside circle here. So manufacturing took care of craft, and digital helped aid manufacturing. And then we kind of used all of that to get better physical products. And then what I would argue is that digital became its own product, physical becomes a product, and platform becomes a product. Creativity begins to spill into this idea. When we organize ourselves in large groups, we develop platforms, and who better to be at the table at that discussion to designers? We're not just making the clothes and the chairs and the objects and the cars, but maybe we should also be in the conversation of how we get to use those as a group, as a society, and what that becomes. Platforms are really wonderful things that we discuss, and I think it's opened up our program a lot. The new kind of piece on the outside here is what's called management. How do we organize these things? So the designer, as we go out into society, we say, hey, what do designers do? When we ask other people, and people say, well, they draw things. I'm like, okay, that's really limiting. So how do we understand that designers can be, sit at the table longer in these conversations, and management becomes a part of that? A really great quote that I heard from Bjarke Ingels young in his career, like probably about 15 years ago, when he was first kind of doing his lecture circuit, was he kind of, when a student asked him about well, how do you actually say that you can design anything when you're always traveling, you have 200 people in your firm, and you're doing all this stuff, and I know he has many more now. He thought about it for a second, and this is the quote my students hear from me all the time too, which is that he said, or he asked the student, what do you draw with? And the student said, well, my pen and this sketchbook. And he's like, that's right, I use that too, but I also have learned to draw with people. That the way we've built our firm, and this kind of goes into their egalitarian system in Denmark and the way they work, everybody is a part of the conversation, and that conversation develops a kind of harmony or a rhyming to it, where people can actually start to collectively make decisions, and we start to realize we work in groups. This is actually a really important concept in our program, is to let students experience the individuality of design process, but also remove them from the hero model, so that they can understand that there are communities and groups involved. And oftentimes designers are just, we hold the space for these things to happen. And notice here that digital is no longer, like back here, its own piece. It's now started to envelop all things, because digital has permeated our lifestyle. That even in our transactions, 30 years ago, you could take paper money and buy an object, and it went through a mechanical machine to make that transaction. But now we move through digital spaces to buy objects that then can potentially have digital lives afterwards. So I think that's really interesting. Where I place our program, the diagram I like to show a lot, is that MDD intersects all these things. It's in constant flux, and it totally and consistently responds to these. And so And that what I mean by that is there's a yin and a yang here that, and in one sense, like traditional design schools, our students can focus deeply on something. In another sense, they can really back out and start to investigate the larger systems and how to represent that. And then you know, as far as thoughts on design education go, before I get into the model, one of the things that we share in our program is that we get to, or we have what's called the permission to say no. This is something that existed before I got here, and it was just really wonderful to merge with this concept. And the faculty that were here is that students can arrive at something, and I think it's really important for designers to say, maybe something doesn't need to exist that's extra. Maybe what we can do is start a conversation. And that what we've learned, especially through digital spaces too, not everything needs to be a product on a shelf. Sometimes we can actually start to buy into experiences, or we can recreate experiences. And that designers don't always have to be profit driven. They don't always have to bring revenue and things like that. So my thoughts on design education, this is really important. This is my favorite part of this talk, which is where I get the most excited, and it's about this human experience. And I want to, like my rough little diagram here, I want to talk about what I call deviating the standard model. What we have here, if you've studied any amount of statistics or just kind of been through general classes and how we look at information, excuse me. What we have here is what I call a scatter plot, right? And so the scatter plot often reveals, hopefully, if you're doing some data right and made some good hypothesis, that you're going to get some cluster towards some central axis that sets a norm. Let's just say that these dots, these little squiggles, all imperfect and arranged around, are students. And this is what I came into. I came into this idea that, and what I learned as a young person and what I saw around me in varying degrees of sometimes pulling people forward and sometimes pulling people backwards, like oftentimes some destruction in this, is that if the closer I sat to the middle, the happier the system was that I participated in, my teachers were, and my family was, and all the people around me. And what design offered me is a chance to look at what I see up here in the top right, which is an outlier. So this blue line around this is that kind of normal field. If you sit in that field, you're probably going to be okay in your career. I began to notice these couple of dots out here, and I didn't see myself as one of these dots, but I will argue that we all are. But I saw a few people, a few students, whether they had graduated already, they were already in the news, they were out there, and I saw that they were kind of performing in ways that they were doing extraordinary stuff, but they were doing it, as I call, in the light, with this kind of freedom. Nothing was stopping them. They could hear the messages in the cluster in the middle of what it takes to be there. And they kept saying, I'm not worried about them. I'm looking forward. I want to do more. I want to understand these things better. And then pop, they come off the academic bubble. They end up developing their own companies, or they go into some sort of expression of what it was they were looking at. And it looks to be not just successful from the outside, but freeing, to where this person's like just really being themselves as a designer, as a creative, and that their voice is truly their voice. And so the outlier model is something I began to pay attention to. And what I noticed over time is that if you start to stack the years up and stop looking at it as every year, how are the students doing? But over the years, what does the collection of these outlier little dots look like? You get designers, entrepreneurs, strategists, you can read the list going down. And all of these words, you start to realize these are people you may know in your life, and they exhibit characteristics where they are pulling at the edge of what we understand in creativity, and they're telling us where we might go, sometimes correct, sometimes incorrect, but still there is this kind of pull that they bring to us, and that they're leading something. And what I found, that there's these consistent behaviors in this, which is that somewhere along the line, they gave themselves permission to trust what was truly inside. One of the great things I always tell students when they come to me, especially when they come into class, is like, look, here's the deal. You can only be you. Now, if we can get you there this semester, that's great. But at some point, it's going to happen. So the longer you take to get there, the more difficult it's going to be to actually get through the design process, because the design process requires you to be completely aware and present of you, yourself, your surroundings, and everything around you. Every time you try to put on a different hat or be something else, you get in trouble. We can all remember this in our careers. Those hats are important to try on, though. And so what I propose in my own model, and even before I came to Utah, is that we take this crosshair, this axis, this norm, and we place it up at the outliers, because the permission is the only thing that's keeping people away from this space, that deep down inside of us, at our base, at our core, we're genius and we're creative and we can recreate this all the time. Let's create a program that gives that permission. Now, I fully want to acknowledge that it's a little bit silly to talk about this because universities are already exclusive, right? We're already basically saying some can be here, some cannot be here. And even when we get into programs like ours, where we have an acceptance rate and we have a much higher pool to pull from, it's difficult to tell students no. So in some ways, we're not doing the best job, but maybe this model can also translate down into earlier grade levels and public school systems. But this kind of fear, this idea that we project on young people, where we're scared that they're going to fail, is actually one of the reasons they fail. It's our fear, right? But when you pull back and you hold a space for students to basically bump around and get things right and not get things right, they start to figure out who they are, and that confidence that emerges is incredible. After all of these years, I'm more impressed with that confidence than I am with my own understanding of things. You know, I thought that I would get to this part in my career and I'd say, I just have all this information, I can give it back to students and they'll understand it. But really, I've come to find that education is a spatial construct, which I'll get to in a moment. Now, these are three images that a lot of you will recognize. Virgil Abloh just passed away, which I have to say, one of his quotes is wonderful. And I'm glad to hear that these things kind of repeat and reverberate through the sphere, which is that basically the acknowledgement of the products will come and go that you design, the experiences and everything. It is the process in which you work in that stays with you. It is the process that you live on. It is your process, and is the reason people will want to work with you, because they know what it's like to work with you and what that process is. And what that tells us is when we start to develop our process, that's unto us, and we're only looking like us, right? It goes back to this concept of get to you as quick as you can in education. Zaha Hadid, I think, is someone I always struggle with because her lectures were just really fiery, and she was, I mean, her opinions were there, like whenever you heard her speak. She had this boundless energy of this ability and this concept of, I will design it. Like Virgil Abloh was the same way. He was trained as an architect, but he was like, I'm just going to use architecture as a tool to get me into fashion, to get me into other things. And then it was just, you could tell that there was this self-driven propulsion to go where he wanted to go. Zaha Hadid had the same energy. He just stood in the same room as her. You realize she was going somewhere, and then you realize, am I going somewhere? Why don't I have that pull? And I'll tell you, for anybody who's listening who hadn't felt that yet, that pull is your own permission. It's your own way to kind of get there. That's the beautiful thing about creativity. It's one of the few professions where we can really look at ourselves and say, what do we want to do next? Charles and Ray Eames are one of the earlier models where I use them because it's where society began to see how we could actually break out from traditional creative models of just making drawings and actually making experiences. Their career expanded through textiles and film and architecture and furniture and all kinds of things even beyond that. And I think it's important to look at their stories because the world, I think, began to understand that as a career, as a way that we kind of go back out into society, the Eameses were an example of how it could move out. And then that gets reflected into companies. And I just, this is kind of the part where I want to say, and all the logos that are up here, from Allbirds to Square and Pinterest. Square, I'm referring to actually Jack Dorsey. I could put up Twitter, but that's that's another thing. But Jack Dorsey was in fashion design before he got there. Pinterest was architecture and UX grads. Allbirds was product designers, and so was Airbnb. But it's what I call the funnels and the edges of stuff, right? And kind of bringing that conversation also what gets me so excited. This is why I'm so grateful at the University of Utah, being able to work with faculty who also work on this idea. The funnels that I'm talking about is if you look at traditional design schools, and I think for really good reasons, they tend to lean towards manufacturing or building and making, especially in industrial design. They are creating a funnel so that when you come out, you can go work for the industry you have intended to work for. This is the conversation I have with parents all the time. What is my child going to do? Where are they going to get a job? The funnels are important because there was a time we needed that. But what we have stepped back to, where the Eameses had started to introduce this idea, is this idea of the generalist approach, where designers can use the tools that they have to solve many, many problems. And the edges of stuff is when I kind of go back and I talk about what are the possibilities. The reason I'm here is because after studying architecture for 5 years and even practicing in firms and getting to do that work, I obviously grew very fond of it, and it was just a beautiful experience. The edges of stuff is where you start to look out, and those outliers I saw earlier is people would, like, they would fall off the edge, and like they wouldn't do the building, they would do furniture. There was the famous controversy at Rice University where a faculty, instead of doing the building for musicians, decided to have everybody build a mandolin. And I think the faculty was not asked to teach there again because of that, but I still remark that as probably one of the most incredible experiences you could have in a design, that there is still time to understand buildings, but this idea of creating a musical instrument to better familiarize yourself with the space you might create for that instrument to exist in is really profound. And out of the edges, that's why I showed the companies before about Pinterest and other things. That Pinterest came from the need of precedence. I want to see all the buildings that I want to see as I'm engaging in and designing other things. And so it became this useful tool that ended up becoming a whole industry into its own. So that's the edges. And the funny thing I always say too is that this program is built largely off the backbone of architectural education. Because if you think about it, if you ask an architect to go design anything like fashion or a pair of pants, architects are like, of course I'll do that. I'll design it. What size do you want? What color? Where is this going to be in Italy? Is this going to be in America? And if you go ask an industrial designer, hey, make a pair of pants, you're like, that's not my job. I'm not touching that. But there's this kind of ego base of the architect's education that allows them to see that. So I think that part, in a healthy way with values and ethics, is really good for people to understand. And this actually goes beyond even design schools, because we see that. So the fundamental principle, before we get into some of the student work here, is to talk a little bit about the quick way that I like to describe how we approach our curriculum in our program. And when you sit in a lot of design schools, and we did this through programs that I participated in at different universities and stuff, it's like, okay, we're going to design a chair. And then students jump into, okay, what's ergonomics? How big is a body? What is it for? All this kind of stuff, right? But they come at it from the idea of designing a chair. I think in our program, what I really love is that this question, again, this was kind of here when I got here, it was a wonderful merger, is this idea that you get to ask the question of, what does it mean to sit? And from this perspective, what you're enabling is taking the designer out of the drawing mode, the drawer, right? The designer then becomes the observer. The designer becomes the person that asks the question. And all of a sudden, the designer can take this question and make the chair if they need to, decide that most of the world's population chooses to not use a chair, which in some cases is true. And so therefore a chair doesn't exist, but maybe you talk more about social constructs and the way that we actually engage as communities. And then we go back even further, and maybe if the chair needs to exist, that student can actually begin to start that company in a sustainable way and begin to engage in this kind of commercialization of their idea, and potentially change how we do everything, right? Instead of companies growing out of business schools, why don't companies grow out of other places too? Instead of business schools coming to us and saying, hey, we need a couple of your students to draw this image for us. Why don't we go to them and say, hey, we've got a great idea. We need some of your students to build a business around it. And so how do we change that conversation and get designers up to this other level? Spatial and object relationship, I'll talk about this, just really briefly here, is the idea that I think in this kind of concept of the night sky, that it's really important to understand that we have spent centuries, if not thousands of years, understanding the sky as civilization and what it means. And we always talk about the constellations and the stars and what they're made out of. But what I always argue to students is, as designers, I think that we have to be more spatial than the star. That the way to frame your role in society is to not so much understand the star as the space in between each star. In fact, the star is inobservable without the space or the kind of non-star, right? With the non-star, with the space in between, we can actually see the shape of things. We can look at that. And so I've always been encouraged by my mentors, and I try to push that down into students, is that always understand the space that you're working in. Turn everything into a spatial concept. Otherwise, if you focus on the object, it goes very flat very quickly, and you oftentimes cannot see the edges of the object or what touches it. When you focus on the space, you're aware of both the objects that you're working with, but also the things that surround it and might affect it. And we begin to realize that it is a space around something that allows us to see it and gives it shape. It's kind of like you don't understand a room until you introduce light to it, right? So understanding light and the way we work with objects is also important too. Location and knowing is pulls off of that concept. And students will say, I don't know what I want to do for my final product. I don't know what I actually want to be when I leave here. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of an American thing, right? I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lawyer. I want to work for this company. I want to work for that company. And I cannot show you someone later in life that will tell you that was really the best plan. What I can show you is people that will tell you all the experiences they had while doing those things. And most importantly, how it made them feel. So I go back to that point, which is I ask students, how do you want to feel in the next 5 years? Do you want to feel empowered by your work? Do you want to feel like you're working in groups and doing something big for the world? Do you want to feel in some geolocation, like I need to be in Europe, I need to be in the mountains or on the ocean's edge or in the desert or someplace like that? Let's start with this idea of feeling of what you want to do, and then we can apply design to that. We can apply your whole career to that. And if you really relax in that, you'll actually have pretty tremendous experiences, because when you start to look long enough and have enough rearview mirror, you start to realize, especially as a designer, you've always kind of been in the place that you needed to be, and that your patterns and your behaviors of how you want to work as a designer are all collected in that. And then you can start to get your location and knowing. But it's also okay to understand you may not know where you're going to land, but you know how you want to feel, and that's kind of ultimately what you want to craft and be. And that kind of gives you the knowing. And then this other piece, before we get to the student work, is really simple, which is something that I think in the past 2 or 3 years I've started to really talk about. These two words are super disorienting, and I think that they are confusing. I would argue that most people come to design school because they want to be a designer, and I would never remove that label. But I will tell you, if you go out into the world and you look for jobs as a designer, it's difficult. The people who hire for those jobs are usually people who think you just draw or just know they need it for their company. It's very limited in how that view is kind of pulled out when you look at job applications. If other designers are hiring designers, which is another way to get there, then there's a kind of what I call the firewall. Did you go to my school? Are you as good as me? Did you learn from this faculty? Do you know? It's like there's a weird little ego trip that happens there. And I also began to realize too that the capital D in designer is mortal. It's a thing that's going to live and it's going to die and it's going to come and it's going to go, and it's got this shape. And once again, it becomes what I call the object. But what if we actually gave more emphasis to the word design with a lowercase d? Its design becomes the noun, not so much the person. It becomes the process. We go back to Virgil Abloh's quote about you only own the process. When you use design as a verb, when you use it as a process, this is an everlasting kind of stream of work that has been going on before you, will go on beyond you. You get to dip your toe in it, you get to participate in it. But when you start to say you're a designer, or you're going to use design less as a label for yourself and more as a tool to engage, guess what? The world becomes all the space in between the stars. And when there's space, you don't have to exist on one star. You can move in between all of them. You can engage how you want. You can become the CEO of a company. You can become politically active. You can gather people in your community. You can go straight into consumerism. You can do all the things that you want to do. Because what you start to realize in designers that have actually done things that we find interesting, we want to look at all the resume and all the check marks that they've done, but look at their movement. The capital D did not get them there. It was assigned to them after they got there. It was the lowercase d, using design as a tool. And when we do that, we start to actually give permission to others to use design as a tool. Others meaning those who didn't go to school, people in your community, being able to hand it out and freely give it to the people around you and say, you get to be a part of this process too, then awakens creativity in people, which I will tell you, teaching in other colleges and other professions, people are terrified of creativity because it's been shut down. I mean, we know for a fact that after 12 years old, kids just stop drawing because it's not valued in school. But this idea that design can be more than just the title, it actually frees us up to go do so many things. So a model for research and understanding, a kind of funny thing I'll share about my piece here is that on the left, we have a Nicolas Claude Ledoux building. I was shown this is what architecture was and how it started. And then on the right, I was said, but you have to solve for this and it must look like this. In school, I thought, okay, this is the formula. I look at it now and I think it's actually really funny because I'm just like, none of these three inform each other. The first one, Ledoux, informs a culture and a society and this kind of Eurocentric view of design and what we must be pushing people through. I look back now and say, was someone really training me to be an architect, or were they training me to be, the white male Eurocentric kind of person, a view that was pushed on me? And that what if architecture grew up in a tiny box, or even design, product design, in another country, somewhere else with different cultural values? How does that start to express itself? And something that I've had to come to learn as well. So let me push you through a couple of projects so we can kind of get to a point here. And I'm really proud of this work. And I believe that in any program, I want to pull out recent and relevant work. So I want to kind of give the framing for this in the sense that these students were doing this work through COVID, through working online, and just really kind of having a disassociated experience with their academic careers, which is incredibly stressful. But what I have found is in the way that the whole world was compressed during this, a lot of our students would comment that their process, the lowercase d design, and kind of moving things, it actually helped them stay relevant, stay a little bit sane, and to kind of create a safe space for them to be and to work. I'm going to show you three types of projects. We have a platform project, a physical product, and then this is a digital product here. And the first digital product I want to talk about is great. This is a student, Kayla Kingsley, who just graduated and is now working with Adobe, which is a company that Adobe, the software company, has helped us develop our digital curriculum, has been a great partner over the years, and has taken in a few of our students now to work on their teams. Kayla's also is just a really good example of what happens when we do research. Kayla came and wanted to talk about this, a condition where it's about uncontrollable blushing, and about how you could take a condition like that. And a lot of people suffer from it. It's one of those things where it doesn't really happen so pervasively in society that companies are rushing to solve it. So she decided to use our kind of research practice as designers to figure out and tell a story. So the research idea of our program is really simple. We always say that when you are framing an idea, if you come back from, let's not say, let's design a chair or an app or something like that, and you say, what does it mean to sit? And you start to, it's amazing how the end result will begin to shape itself through your process. In other words, I always say you question your product into existence. And I'll go through these kind of quickly. I don't need to over-present their work. It's better from their own presentation. But just to give everybody a sense of what it looks like to do research and frame shape. A lot of the early research looks a lot like you would see in social science programs, business strategy courses, and things like that, where we ask our students to do market assessment and go out and look at the science and to actually talk to real people. One of the things we do with seniors and say, we want you to kind of bust the academic bubble and go out and bring somebody from the outside in. Make sure they can validate what you're saying and what you're hearing. And really, again, showing you these slides is about looking at how our students learn to present the work. So we ask our students to become visually competent. Obviously, that's what design schools do, but we don't teach technical courses here. Through this kind of want and need to make your ideas heard, students begin to adapt visual strategies, and they start to pick up on the basic ordering systems of how we might put presentations together or model objects or physically make things, digitally make things. And in Kayla's particular case, her research and narrative were really important. And I will tell you that even what I'm showing you here is like 1/100th of the research she did. The research platform we use to build up stuff was really, really large on this. And she began to look at the process of how we might use so again, this is the thing that I will tell you is like, we don't make apps in our program. That's just not a thing. They may be a result of someone's project, but what we're trying to do is create experiences. And by acknowledging that, we realize that the experiences can be both physical and digital, moving through a process. Experiences can be emotional. And in fact, in this case, they are. So through those kinds of questions, in this case, an app for a phone, or what we'll call kind of an app/platform, began to develop. And what it would do is you could start to enter in your symptoms and how you were kind of progressing throughout things. It would track, record, use a version of AI to gather and assess so that you could start to better understand how your condition would come up and then how you could plan in the future. So if it was neurological, emotional, environmental, you could start to actually pull back and see your overall patterns and see if you could find predictive behaviors. And then also connecting you to potential doctors who could help and communities and other things. I'm going to tell you again, we have like one UX UI class taught by an amazing faculty from Adobe, and they do cover all the basics. I know the boot camps are out there. I know everybody's doing all this stuff and everyone's trying to convince, and everyone's just really excited, but everyone's also really frustrated by UX and UI. And the point is, UX and UI is frustrating because it's really flat. And because until you start talking about design as experience and start using deeper forms of research and testing, you can't do things. But once you had that information, the actual design of UX and UI becomes pretty, it flows, I should say, pretty well. If the student chooses to apply themselves, it can become professional quickly, because when you ask the right questions, the visual strategy becomes evident, all the things become evident that you need to do. So this student went really thorough into it and pulling in all the elements of what this would look like. I was just really, really proud of that process that Kayla did. Xander Bricky, I love this. I wanted to pull this project in because this is a physical product. This kind of fits more of a traditional model of how we might come up with seating. But what I'm really most proud of in this student work is, again, the research and strategy, and again, questioning the project into existence. I kept telling Xander, please don't design a chair. Please don't design a chair. Just go in and look at social behaviors. And so he did. He started. It's like, I don't want any sketches or drawings. Just let's go through this. And Xander just really went into what he called the effects of loneliness, especially as COVID was kind of like ramping up at that point. We were starting to really feel the impact. And he looked at social spaces and loneliness and pulled all this research in. It became, or as I like to say, he geeked out about the space he was in. Teach us about what you're about to work in, like really become a professional at it. And he started to look at public social spaces and how we might gather and collect information back and forth with each other as we kind of sit. And then this is where it started to get exciting. And these are the things that from when those of you who had architectural backgrounds, when you start to map out your site and start to draw all the relationships beyond just the thing, right? This is kind of one of the follies of industrial design programs, is that they just start drawing the object and the ergonomics around it. But when you start to draw the space around it, other things start to fall out of it. And when you combine those two disciplines together, research methods from industrial design and this kind of spatial aspect of architectural education, and then you bring in other things like strategy from business schools, you start to get a more whole view and vision of what something can be and how it gets to exist. And so you can see that this was taking off previous studies of, this is it's not Union Square, it's in it's the park right by NYU with the big arch. Washington Square Park. It's written up there on the screen. And starting to look at the existing studies and doing his own drawings and mapping and looking at densities and grouping, he started to develop drawings. I said, keep drawing until something starts to fall out of it. And so the information that fell out of it is where people feel comfortable and don't feel comfortable, and what groups feel like and how they naturally assemble. This is all social research that sits out there that he's able to pull from. And within that, he keeps drawing on top of the clusters and keeps looking at it, and then here's the information coming through it. And then, it starts to get tighter and tighter with the information, as you can see here. And then through all this process too, if you've worked with me before as a student, you know that I have this great interest in how drawing is this language that goes beyond just having an idea. It actually can prove your idea, but it also reveals the spaces in your idea that you can't quite see through your words. Or just even mocking something up, because drawing offers views, especially like non-perspective views, orthogonal views that shows us order and form and ways. And so this started to develop and shape to shape. And you can start to see through the research, and again, being thorough, following through, telling your story, that from the very first image I showed you, you start to see these shapes emerge, these patterns emerge, the drawings become beautiful. And what I mean by beautiful is that through this drawing, if you didn't know what the project looked like, you would still recognize some beauty in that. This way that we can recognize that a tree is beautiful, or the way that physics kind of affects, or the nature and physics of the earth affect itself to make mountains and trees and waves and other things. When we start to see that in our own work, it starts to come out and starts to inform. And what I love about this is that there is a different guide to how the shape is made. It's not just the student saying, I'm going to gesture at this until it becomes something. It is truly witnessing a whole nother process happen in front of you that seems to be greater than you, and is giving you answers that are good. Now, there's aesthetic value that gets applied through your own filter as a human being, like what Xander was doing, what he wanted to do. But it came up with this. And regardless of whether or not this is my style or what I want to see, I actually like it. I think it has kind of a very cool kind of like both timeless and timed like 80s kind of feel to it, but also in the way it engages and pulls through. But I just really appreciated how we got there and looking at the basic form. Some of the caveats in our program that we come to also is that we do get to manufacturing points and we realize, oh, well, the whole idea of discussion in manufacturing is where you need industrial design programs. It's where you need that partner, that student that can actually pull the aesthetics through and maintain the value of this and get through. It's kind of like when graphic designers or, they step in and say, okay, you know what, you did good, but let me just really tighten this up because there are, 2,000 years of discussion about why we want to see this a certain way. And we get there. And the last one I want to show you is kind of fun and reflects when we do let students really trust themselves and allow that the culture a student can be in currently is validated, right? Oftentimes when in design schools, we try to mature students really quickly and understand things that are maybe 20 or 30 years beyond them. But in this case, Austin Aubrey, who ended up actually becoming a teaching fellow in our program too, and so does Caleb, by the way. He wanted to look at this culture of sitting in lines and waiting to buy products that we see from companies like Supreme and like shoe drops, sneaker drops, things like that. And we have that culture here in Salt Lake City as well. I know it's also in other cities, obviously. And then how that just kind of got erased in COVID and how we could absorb that. And so I just said, okay, let's do this. I need you to teach me about it so I better understand and bring me into the culture, because the reality is this is a multi-billion-dollar industry and that there are people working on it. And what I found great is that industry from Salt Lake City all the way to New York City and eventually into LA and other places responded to Austin and what he's doing. And he's now working with a firm in New York City and working on kind of marketing, branding strategies. And it's been hired on because of this project. This project allowed him to show himself as viable to the industry and move out and to do these things. And this is really, again, where I love what our faculty do when we step back and we say, no, you need to do this and be this and understand it. It's not for me to tell you I can look at the validity of the work and the research, but I really want you to tell the story. So the lounge went through and we started to look at marketing research for retail and going into different disciplines and figuring out what retail looked like and how it has moved from physical to digital experiences, especially how COVID has kind of brought all these new tools in. And so he did all these modeling of existing shops here in town and also from articles that were being written about retail experience in other places, and got really thorough. It's like there was a line to buy shoes and now there's not. How can you do a project with that? And even I told him, I was like, look, if you take the line away and you try to make some digital line, it might fail as a project, but I think what's successful is that you're looking at this intently as an experience project and you're giving some validation to what is a real experience and what people call the hype of a project and trying to understand it. It's like, if you want to be in that industry, this is what you do. Like, it's not for me to tell you, you can't go here and you can't do this, or maybe the industry's not mature enough. It's really for me to say, if this is where the space you want to be in, let's figure out what the language is and how to go deeper in that. What was really nice about this, again, is that all the local stores and places got behind him 100%. They participated in reviews. They wanted to hear more about it. They let him come and present his work over and over. And so he had to speak in two languages, one that they would understand, and then one that he could come back academically and prove that he was doing our process and work. And so these are just stuff where he would come in and look and break it down. And so again, I think what I grouped, I'm kind of taking 4 slides and grouping them together for Austin, is just to show you that we take this seriously. We don't gesture at our work. I noticed that, even when I work in the entrepreneurship program here on campus and other places, that everyone wants to come in and like, I have an idea, I gestured at it, so it's good. And what we teach our students is, no, you need to validate it. You need to go out and show us that you understand the shape and where it is. And what's really cool is when we bring in industry executives and other people, we oftentimes show them views they had never considered. And they begin to look at things differently. I've seen this happen with Austin's project, looking at industry leaders when they see the view differently, all the way to, we had a student work on experience design and working with Discord and other things and bringing it into the NFL, and executives in the NFL, the National Football League, were like, oh, wow, we've never even seen this. Like, this is It's because we don't realize how siloed other communities are. Even looking in the art world, we had students do digital collections and stuff like that. Social impact, when we do studios in that in our junior year, community organizations are often giving views that have never been seen before. And this is what it means to enable designers to have bigger conversations, not just to design the chair, but to ask, what does it mean to sit? When you put the creative process and you bound it or make it boundless, let's say, it starts to solve problems and it starts to become inclusive to where not just the designer can do it, but anybody that joins that team can be a part of that conversation. So again, I just also really like the narrative that Austin created to this, and just kept using visual strategy to pull us through. And then what he ended up coming off with, and I also like that he went into line psychology and did all these other things, and he talked to people on campus and figured out who was doing work. And oftentimes designers get glancing views of things, but we try to get it deep enough, can be quoted, and we can actually build our bibliographies and do it's called soft research in our program, but the observational research becomes real research and hardened research. He ended up coming up with the lounge, and in some ways it was really revealing. I think the research really offered more to brands, the lounge, and how you wait and develop community, and you can kind of be in there and talk to people, change the playlist of music, and kind of start sharing in a space, because the idea is that companies didn't want to lose the hype or the waiting or the chance, the lottery effect, or whatever it is they were going for. But the idea that this digital space could be there, whether it's effective or not, that would have to be practiced and put out to the real world. But the fact that he used that space to discover opportunities for other existences and how we engage in retail experience, and there's no charge to this, right? Can this happen in a place where product is not being, it's more sustainable, basically? How can you start to create this, and how does experience become the product? I thought was really important. And so then this is a fun moral quote. So that's really the last I wanted to say, and I'll say thank you. And I'm going to stop share here so my face comes alive. Let's see. And so I'm here, and I just want to say thanks to everybody for listening. And if anyone, there's some questions here I see in the chat. How do designers work cross-functionally with developers, copywriters, project managers? Well, yeah, I think even before, so maybe before I answer that question, I think my ending comment here and what I want to leave everybody with is, I think we oftentimes make a lot of mistakes in the labels that we give ourselves, that we say that because we are a designer, we must interact this way. What I've noticed and appreciated most about working with startups and entrepreneurs and people who just go out and take a lot of risk is they don't work that way. They are willing to be labelless. They often shift into different roles and different modes, and the ones who are successful truly acknowledge where they are and where they're at exactly that time, and they become whatever needs to be in that space. And secretly, designers are taught to do this, but then we start chasing the label of working for this firm, or if I don't do this, then I'm not going to be successful. Or if, in 10 years, like we always carry this weird, everybody does when they graduate, like, what are my faculty going to think about what I'm doing now, right? I always tell students, look, if you're happy, that's all I care about. But this idea of being open. So when you do cross functionality with developers, I will tell you that it's a spatial experience. Designers should be leaders, and they should come in and listen and reflect back what the developers and project managers and everyone is saying. And what you're going to find is that everyone's just as scared as you are. Or if they're like trying to tighten you up and go down a very direct path, and you can see that there's a lot of risk in that path. Again, trying to understand and get their perspective, constantly taking on the views of others allows you to adapt their language, and then begins to offer what I would call a really good unbiased space for the better things to happen. Truly, you want things to flow, and you want people in an egalitarian society to recognize the good idea when it exists. This might take, and so the part of that question that is difficult is it can happen in one day, or it might take 3 years, it might take 5 years, right? And sometimes it doesn't work, and companies have to dissolve and reassemble, and teams have to do that. But the idea I would come back to that point is spatially. How can you listen and better hear what the needs of the others are so that you can do it, just like if you're working with a client? How can people foster creativity as adults who work in varying industries? Look, I'll tell you this. This goes back to I've just seen this so much in my career, just working one-on-one with students in the classroom, is permission. I think inviting people into the creative space can be really scary because they've been told, it could be something as dumb as like they made a drawing, when they were 8 years old, and someone next to them said, "That's the ugliest drawing I've ever seen," and boom, it's gone. And so you might be inviting someone to a creative conversation when that trauma is still really fresh, even though it might be 30 years later. So like creativity, as we know, all the teachers in it, we know that it brings a lot of emotion into the classroom. And it's usually within that emotion and those walls that we build up where we have to conquer that. And every student knows this, like you just have to push past things. But I do think that permission and just letting people come in at the level, meeting people where they are, letting them come in at the level and finding, opportunities to reinforce what was good about the process and what's happening there is important. But I also think having an open and honest discussion about, hey, do you guys want to try a creative process to get this going, and then see what people say. And then what you'll find is really simple. You can draw things on the wall, you can sketch things down, you can do the post-it note technique that you see, but open, just having that dialogue. How does this is always I think an important question. How does equity, diversity, and inclusion translate to design? Are there diversity issues in the design world, and how can those issues be addressed? I want to go back to a comment I made earlier, and I'm sad that it dawned on me later. Two things happened. Yes, they're huge issues, and diversity is a huge issue. Equity too. I used to tell students early in my architecture teaching education before I moved into product and experience design, when students weren't doing well, I said, look, you need to do this to be an architect. This is what architects do. And I felt really comfortable with that. And all of a sudden I'd watch them kind of swell up, and then they would like push harder, and they would just push themselves through what was like a pinhole of the space to get through, to get their work to do better and everything. And then someone finally just tapped me on the shoulder and said, "What's an architect?" And I was like, oh, well, I guess I never really thought about it. I just kind of assumed it, right? I assumed that it was craft. I assumed that it was drawing, and that you had to draw like Neil Denari, and you had to do this and think like Zaha Hadid and all these things. But I said, but where did that conversation begin? And then it dawned on me, someone brought to me gently also this Eurocentric model of education. It's like, oh, it's not that I'm training someone to be an architect. I'm asking all these students, regardless of race, color, religious beliefs, gender, anything. I'm asking them to be some white males from a certain time where we started to write history books and produce curriculum and do all these things. And I just felt, tremendous shame, obviously, because I had participated in it, and I had potentially been pushing people through this. And then I had another faculty here in Utah kind of tell me, yeah, well, what do you think color theory would look like if it had come out of Northern Africa and not, Eden and Germany and the Bauhaus and the way we teach it? And I was like, oh yeah, we'd probably put an emphasis very differently on things, and we'd think about it differently. And then the further question came out, which is, well, what if that was one of many? And what if there was that students were taught all the different color theories? And we know scientifically there are different color theories, but culturally there are different color theories. And I think people naturally practice this in other places. But so that part is something we have to really acknowledge. And I will say that when you look at articles written about the GSD and what Sarah Whiting's doing at Harvard, they're acknowledging those things. They're starting to pull that out. We definitely do that here at the University of Utah. I am not the forefront of that. I am learning. I work with faculty who really approach these things, I think, at a higher level than I do. And then as far as access to education, I think universities, I just think we have to think about education different and figure out how to release design and architecture and product design and graphic design from universities and allow it to exist in communities more freely without pedigree. And so that's one of the ways it can be addressed, is that ultimate permission, and that let universities become a place for focus and depth, which people would argue that it is, but there's a pretty closed off container because people always ask, where did you go to school? Who would you work for? And instead of looking at, I met with a terrific designer recently who came out of finance and is now in design, but has found difficulty finding his feet because, he didn't have that pedigree, but he's clearly an amazing designer. What are some of the ways that UVU alumni can support this program? There are two really specific ways. I think that equity and equity, diversity, scholarships, and ways, or getting out to the community and finding ways to give people permission to contact us, to come talk to us and engage in our program is really important. Design schools can seem a little bit scary and a little bit on a pedestal. But giving everyone that's listening today this kind of ultimate, again, permission to say that the doors are open is really important. Second, I think it has never failed to amaze me that when you can take a student, no matter where they come from, and put them on a different place in the planet for an extended period of time, they are changed as people. Culturally, we see that here in Utah. People tend to travel here, they tend to move around. So people here know the value of that. And they change in the way that they're able to go back into their communities and help, the way they're able to build their careers for their own selves and their own kind of work, and just to become stronger designers. It just happens every time. Giving students the opportunity to travel and sitting next to a student on a plane that has never been on a plane before in their lives and is actually sitting on a 16-hour flight to southern China or to Italy or to South America, and understanding the gravity of that moment in their own lives and their own courage and their own even disbelief that they're doing it, and knowing that this will just reverberate back into their lives and everybody that they know, and that they'll hopefully pay it forward one day too, is incredible. I think scholarships for travel are just life-changing and potentially the most impactful. And even just keeping in contact with the program and getting to know the faculty is really great. So that's the last of the questions. I really want to thank everybody again for your time and listening. I feel it. I feel that everybody's out there. It's a bit of a black box there, but thank you again, everyone.